Welcome to ListenUP by UpLIFT West Virginia. I'm Gabrielle Marshall de la Torre. UpLIFT West Virginia is a project that focuses on lifting people up out of poverty by listening, inviting, fulfilling, and thriving. By providing listening platforms, we can identify the issues that are most pressing to those on the margins of society. Folks are invited into places of leadership where they can learn how to strategically plan, pursue, and engage issues most important to them. Leaders guide the community to implement strategic plans by empowering people to have seats at the table where decisions are made, creating communities that move beyond merely surviving to thriving and celebrating successes by embracing our inherent dignity. Each episode, we will discuss the issues that impact those on the margins of society.
I just felt like they felt like we were all done in almost an injustice because they might have had a chance, because when anybody getting out of prison has a fire under them to do good, and if you don't act on that in a certain amount of time, that fire goes out. Thank God my fire burnt a little longer than others.
For many of us, the ID process is only the battle of waiting in line at the DMV. In general, most people think of their ID when police lights are flashing in the rearview mirror, at the bar, and catching our next flight. For most, it's just an annoying card that needs renewed every few years, and for others, it means life or death. Today, we're talking about the conundrum surrounding personal identification. Without a driver's license or state ID, you can't access social services such as public housing, medical care, or SNAP and EBT. But finding all the necessary documents to get an ID, such as your social security card, your birth certificate, might prove nearly impossible. If you don't have stable housing, then how can you show proof of residency? If you don't have money, how can you afford a trip to the DMV, as well as the fee for the ID itself? This catch-22 traps one in a cycle of poverty and limits a person's ability to lift themselves out of a complicated situation, often tragic circumstances. For those who are previously incarcerated, experiencing homelessness, an ID means freedom. Ryan Ewing is an AmeriCorps member at the Mother Jones Center of Resilient Community, and he's a member of UpLIFT West Virginia. Ryan was released from the Huntsville Correctional Center on April 22nd of 2021 after serving 18 months. He didn't have a state ID, and he didn't have the guidance on the outside. All he had was hope, his wits, and a little fire. After getting out, he moved directly into a homeless shelter in Charleston, West Virginia. He arrived with no information, no direction, and no idea what to do. All Ryan had was a prison ID, which he was told was useless. He had Medicaid, which is often difficult to use without an ID. But it turns out his prison ID wasn't completely useless after all. Ryan got lucky. A stranger told him how to get an ID. Without this seemingly random interaction, he wouldn't be where he is today. Here's Ryan on how he learned about the post-prison pathway to IDs.
Well, I met an old man who got out of federal prison, and he had his, and he told me that, took me to the DMV with him, and I talked to the people, and they told me that first told me I needed a letter of residency and my social security card and all my stuff, but then I looked up on the jail website, or on the DMV's website, and it told me that the ID I had from prison was supposed to be honored by the DMV for 90 days, that it's valid. And I showed them that, and they just put me straight in the line to get it. And then I paid the $17 and got my ID.
Ryan had a prison ID, but didn't know what he could do with it.
There was, in the time I was there, probably 12 of us that got out, and none of us knew that we could use our prison IDs to get our regular IDs. So we have 3 months time before the prison ID expires. I found out right at the last minute that you could get it. So I got mine, but...
And what about for those who didn't meet someone with this information? What about those who were turned away at the DMV but had no fire left to turn back?
So without that, I was just felt lost, and out of all of us, I was able to get a job. A couple of the other guys started working, but the ones that didn't get an ID immediately just fell off. 3 of them died from overdoses. 4 of them went back to prison, and then there's literally me and 2 other guys left. The rest are all on the run right now because there was just resort to the old way of what you knew before you went. because it was like you're at a homeless shelter. You have nothing. You have barely any food. It's like, what do you do to survive at that point in time? But
Ryan tried to let them know as soon as he could. By then, for most, it was too late. The 90 days had passed, and the prison IDs were expired.
my heart goes out to them because now I was looking them up on the websites and they're all back. Almost all of them are going back or on their way. They're in receiving and going to their prisons to go serve another term, and it sucks.
If Ryan had to get his ID the traditional way, it would have likely taken so long he'd be back where he started, either homeless or in prison. For those released from prison, coming out of homelessness, and even those coming out of the foster care system, the expectations of the bureaucratic process are impossible.
So in order for me to have gotten my ID before I went to prison, I would have had to have had a notarized paper, a copy of my mother's ID, but she was in active addiction, so she didn't have that. And so next step would be my grandmother, who I would have had to have notarized documentation to send papers back and forth to Texas. That takes about 3 months. Finally get that, apply for my Social Security card, and find a way to get 2 forms of residency for my Social Security card. That's another probably 2.5 months. And then finally be able to have all my stuff and get my ID. It's like a 6 to 7, maybe 8 month process. And then to look for a job after that, it's almost like to get my first paycheck's like a year worth of work. And it was like, it's not realistic, so that's why I never really tried. I never really started the process to it. Plus, I didn't have anywhere to live really to get my proof of residencies or to have mail sent. So it was bad.
Like Ryan said earlier, how are you to survive? A year with no home to call your own, no safety in your job, inability to access some essential medical care.
If I didn't have an ID, I would have had to find some way to make money somehow, some way, because I got out of prison with nothing. So I had multiple people from my past trying to get a hold of me to do things that are not legal. And I probably would have took one of those opportunities just because it was that or nothing.
Ryan says if he didn't have his ID, he wouldn't have anything. He wouldn't have found recovery, a place to sleep, and medical care.
My ID helped me get out of shelter I was able to apply into a recovery home here and get accepted, and came up here, and it gave me better housing, not full housing, but better housing, and now I'm applied on all the housing lists. Which I would not have been able to. That ID, I had needed surgeries that I wouldn't have been able to get because they were considered elective surgeries, so it wasn't an emergency, and I had to have an ID for those. I couldn't imagine my life without having my ID right now. I would literally have nothing.
Ryan explains this is more than an issue of bureaucracy. It's an injustice and the insurance of a prison cycle for incarcerated people. He says the answers are simple and they save lives.
I don't know. I just felt like they felt like we were all done in like almost an injustice, because we should have been more informed when we got out. None of us knew that we could use our prison IDs as anything. We were actually told that they were not really good for anything. They might have had a chance. Thank God my fire burnt a little longer than others.
When Ryan got out, his fire was burning for his family, his well-being, and his son.
Like, I have a job now. I have my kid in my life. I'm applied for all kinds of services. I have my food stamps. I have my Medicaid. I was able to get my Social Security card, my birth certificate now without any problems because of it. And that's a blessing, huge blessing.
Today, Ryan thrives in Wheeling, West Virginia. He's in AmeriCorps with me at the Mother Jones Center for Resilient Community. We call it the Mojo. He's excelling at his job. He's with the community in classrooms and making an impact. Without his ID, he couldn't have had this opportunity to share his amazing talents with our community.
I don't think I would have a job if it wasn't for that. And if I did, it would be some under-the-table job where I have to take risks of not being paid properly. I paid my taxes, so I can be somewhat of a normal citizen.
It's not much to ask to be a normal citizen. To make this change, the lawmakers, system leaders, and those who have never had this experience need to know the reality of the situation. This is what Ryan has to say.
That not having an ID is why there are so many homeless people, why there's so much crime, why there's so much of what they wish was less, because it's so hard and it's almost impossible. In most people's mind, to get an ID is impossible. That's why I went to prison. It's because I knew that I would not be able to get an ID, and I had to feed my kid. I had things I had to take care of, and I started committing crimes to take care of that. And that would have changed everything if I was able to get my ID back before.
It's bigger than words alone. Ryan knows what needs done to begin the process of systematic change through IDs.
Inform them that of all it takes, that it only takes a letter of residency from wherever you're going. You should have a way of residency from there, because you have to go through a homeland process, and that process means that you are a resident of wherever you're going. So they should be informed. The prison system also should ensure that they have a birth certificate and a social security card, because they have access to get all that without any barriers.
Ryan is changing the system already. He's sharing his story, sharing information, and working with the community to get people IDs and ensure freedom.
Oh, absolutely. I've helped everybody that I know as soon as they re-enter to society from the prison system. I immediately I've informed them. I've helped like 7 people get their IDs that way. I'm working to get something in state with the police department and the DMV to be able for the police department to provide a form of identification to be used at the DMV to obtain an ID, like to maybe jump past the social security card and the birth certificate if the police department can fingerprint you and identify you that way. I think that'd be huge. So I think 33% of all West Virginians have some sort of criminal record, whether that be misdemeanor or not. And they have a file on you. And 33% is a huge number.
Thanks for joining us today on Listen Up by UpLIFT West Virginia. Special thanks to Ryan Ewing for sharing his story and helping our community. You can learn more about ID rights at upliftwestvirginia.org. Become a member today to make change. No fees, only empowerment. For UpLIFT West Virginia, I'm Gabrielle Marshall De La Torre. Special thanks to Ella Jennings for assistance in production and script writing.